Okay, today we are going to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this is going to be a case study on some of the ways in which multiculturalism sometimes comes too much into conflict, where we can't just sort of throw it out there as this feel-good term where we should, accept all cultures, accept all values at all times. But sometimes there are very real, incompatible goals between cultures, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of those examples. And I also want to highlight this for students because this is an issue that's been going on since the 1940s. And you probably hear a lot about it in the news. We hear things like peace in the Middle East, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I just want to give you a little bit of background information on it, just so you're a more educated citizen on the issue. In the last video that I'll put back down in the comment section here, we talked about multiculturalism. Usually when it's talked about as this sort of feel-good embrace of all cultures and values, accepting all cultural norms, not judging other cultures. But we also pointed out, what do you do when there are embedded contradictions within two different cultures? So what happens when cultures do have real values that clash with each other, right? It's one thing to say, allow people to worship the way they want as far as their religion, try, food and dances and music and movies from other cultures. But there are cultural values that are deep and embedded that do clash with one another, and at some point we have to solve the problem, right? At some point we have to make a decision as to what value is going to win out. We can't just accept all values as equal all the time because sometimes they're in conflict. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of those issues. So the long and short of it is that you have the Israelis and the Palestinians, two people groups who are claiming the rights to a piece of land. And this piece of land is, this arrow is pointing here, right, to this little blue strip that you can see right along the coast in the middle of the Arab world. I'm going to put a link down below. I think it's a 7-minute video from Vox, a news organization. And they do a pretty good job discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for the last 70 years in a neutral way. It's a very difficult subject to discuss in a neutral way. If you YouTube Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you're going to come up with very biased reports from one side or another. Vox does a pretty good job staying neutral. There's a couple issues I have with it as far as not being neutral. I think in a couple instances they use the word occupation, and that, it's a little bit of a loaded term, depending on your side of the aisle as far as this issue is concerned. But it does a pretty good job discussing the issue. So go ahead and watch it. But this is what we're talking about, all right? There are two groups of people, Israelis, Palestinians, and they are disputing, who governs this land, right? Like what sort of system is going to be governing this land? Like what should this land be called? Should it be called Israel? Should it be called Palestine? And what people are in charge of it. So the big conflict again, whose land in it, and where do we draw the borders around those lands? We'll talk more about this in a second. What do you do when you have two groups of people who lay claim to the same territory? So again, multiculturalism is nice. It's a nice word to say, like, everybody, everybody's cultural beliefs and behaviors and values are all correct. But sometimes we do have to recognize that we run into cultural values that are in direct contrast with one another, right? And obviously it's like, whose land is this? It's like somebody gets that land and somebody doesn't. And so how do you solve that problem? The biggest controversy in all this is what's known as the city of Jerusalem. This is where a lot of holy sites are for people who are Jewish as well as people who are Muslim. And so they get into some arguments with regard to not only who should govern that land, but whether or not that land should be seen as what we call the true capital of Israel. Recently, the U.S. Embassy was just moved to Jerusalem, and this caused some controversy because it's a recognition from the United States government that Jerusalem is, quote unquote, the true capital of Israel, when there are people who are more supportive of the Palestinian people who don't want Jerusalem recognized as the capital of Israel. They feel like Jerusalem should be a part of Palestine. All right. So a couple key terms, couple key ideas to just summarize this up quickly. first and foremost, we need to recognize that what we're talking about is we're arguing over a piece of land. So this is Israel here, that is the size of New Jersey, right? So it's not very big. The conflict in this comes with the fact that we're arguing over what people consider to be holy land. All right. Who are the chosen people that sort of get to lay claim to this very holy land? All right. So a couple key things, right? Prior to 1948, Palestine, right, was a British colony. The British controlled this region. In May of 48, there was a UN resolution that made Israel a state. So if we think about coming in after World War II, there was a lot of displaced Jewish people, and they had nowhere to go, right? So what do you do with a lot of Jews who had just been liberated out of various concentration camps? For instance, a lot of Europe had been like blown up through bombing and everything else. And so there's all these Jewish people, there's nowhere to go. The British said, hey, we have this sort of, recognized holy spot for the Jewish people. Israel, right? This is the place that Moses brought all the Jewish people out of Egypt, right? Pharaoh, let my people go. Cross over from Egypt into Israel, into this location. So the British said, okay, we'll give you this piece of land the size of New Jersey, and you can settle there, and you can, sort of like reinstate your holy land, right? Call it Israel. On the far side of each of these issues, there are people who are known as Zionists. These are Jewish people who believe in the establishment of a Jewish state. All right. And on the other side, there is Hamas, who is a militant wing of pro-Palestinian supporters. They don't believe that Israel should exist at all, right? So people in the middle of these two say like there should be like a two-state solution. Like, can we just divide up the land? Half of it will be Palestine, half of it will be Israel. And you can kind of have your own governments, and we'll work together as two different nations, as opposed to the nation of Israel trying to negotiate with people within its borders, Palestinian people within its borders, who have different, cultural beliefs, religious norms, etc. Right? A little bit about Hamas, which I think the Vox video explains that. Again, it's in the comment section. Hamas, they do, pay people, they pay suicide bombers to go and blow themselves up in cafes in Israel, and they pay their families a lot of money because obviously the person's dead. Hamas is extremely militant. They do not believe that Israel should exist at all, right? Which is obviously a problem if you're negotiating with someone, right? If you want to have a two-state solution, if you want to live peacefully with someone, but your solution is not only do you have to give up your current country, but everyone who's Jewish here also has to leave this land, because we're going to make this land, we're going to call it Palestine, and only people of, who are of Palestinian descent get to live here. So this obviously becomes a problem. All right. Within Israel at the moment, there are these two spots. One's known as the West Bank, the other one's known as the Gaza Strip, where many Palestinians live, right? It's all within the country of Israel, but there are these regions within Israel that are referred to as Palestinian territories that a lot of Palestinian people live in, but it's still all governed by the Israeli government. And the best way that I can think to describe this to an American college student is if you think about places like Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is its own place with its own governing body, but it's still American territory, right? It's not a state like the rest of the states, but it's still, it has its own culture, right? It has its own government, but it's still overseen, by the United States. So that's that's a close, that's close to what's going on here with Israel and Palestine. All right. Another thing that makes it difficult to negotiate is that legally, right, and this is where I'm sure people are going to be super happy with me, right? Palestine's not a state, right? Legally speaking, right? It's not recognized by the UN as a state. So anytime that the Palestinians want to negotiate with the Israelis through the United Nations, they can't, because the Israelis are like, well, we are in charge of the Palestinian territory, so we're just supposed to negotiate with ourselves. So that becomes a problem. So anytime that the Palestinians want to bring up concerns with the United Nations, they have other nations go and argue on their behalf. So like Iran is very close to the Palestinian people. So Iran will go to the United Nations and sort of argue on Palestine's behalf against Israel if there's problems. All right, which there always are. All right. So this creates problems with the negotiations. Yeah, as far as what's going on in Israel and Palestine. So what do you do when the land that you're on is no longer the land of your ancestors, right? And part of this is that countries have been taking over each other's land forever. So one of the problems, anytime someone says like, give that land back to my ancestral people, is how far back do you want to go, right? And the United States experiences this in its own way with regard to Native American lands, right? This is not unusual. But again, part of the problem is that the people from whom the land was stolen one step back, like those people also stole this from somebody else. So how far back do you go with regard to this giving back of land? Now, you could say, oh, you can go back to the beginning of, as long as we have records and the historical ability to figure out who had that land first. That's fine, right? But this is always a problem because people groups and cultures have been fighting over land and borders and who owns what and who forever. When you also come into the fact that people are as people groups continue to engage with one another, people, the children that are born from that is you have a lot of individuals who are a mix, right, of multiple cultures and multiple people. So at some point you start like arguing with yourself, right? If you're part of a people group who not only overtook a land, but you're also, but you're the other side of your family tree are the ones who lost the land. All right. So this becomes part of the problem with Israel and Palestine. Is the Palestinian people are saying, hold on a second, the British in 1948, it wasn't your land to give to the Jewish people because it was Palestine before it was a British colony. But you start going back a little bit farther, and you're like, well, technically it was part of the Ottoman Empire. So then if you want to get really into it and go back Old Testament times, it's like, well, like God gave this land to Moses, back when they were fleeing Egypt, right? So it's like, how far back do you go with regard to the exchanging of land over this issue and whether or not you have the records? Now, obviously, people are going to challenge the Moses situation and say, well, there's no legal documents. That's a story that was told in a Bible, and who knows if it's true or not. So this becomes a problem with like you keep going back with regard to ancestral land. You also look at the problem is like, what do you do when there's no compromise, right? So again, the compromise that's always thrown out there is say, okay, let's just make a two-state solution. Let's have Israel, you control this part, Palestine, you control this other part, but nobody can decide on where those lines should be drawn. Again, because Jerusalem is the big hub of what everyone's, it's the main part of what people are fighting over when it comes to compromise. And how do you sort of split up Jerusalem between two different governing bodies? All right. But also, what do you do if there's no compromise, right? So again, there are people who are known as Zionists who say, no, this is Israel, end of story. You have people like Hamas and people who sympathize with Hamas who say, no, this entire land should be called Palestine and all the Jews, you gotta go. All right. So obviously, this becomes a problem. All right. There are surrounding Arab states, right? So we talked a little bit about like Iran, for instance, who go to the UN to advocate on behalf of Palestine. But there are also surrounding Arab states that believe that Israel shouldn't exist, right? Now, this isn't all the Arab states, and it's not even all the leaders, right? But sometimes you get different presidents and leaders of different Arab countries who come into power and say, like, I'm running on the campaign that Israel shouldn't exist, and sometimes they get elected, all right? So, for instance, right, you have Mohammed Abbas, who's said the following, right? Like, I will never allow a single Israeli to live among us in Palestinian land, right? So you're like, okay, that's not going to work, right? So his belief is Israel should become Palestine, and then all the Jews who live in Israel, like, you're just going to deport them all, right? He's also said the following over here, like, the Palestinian Authority says that any, oh, he doesn't say this, but this is his position. Palestinian Authority says that any Arab who sells land to a Jew should be put to death. So he's not like, Abbas isn't even about, Palestinian people trying to compromise with the with the Jewish people, right, in the state of Israel. So he wants zero compromise as far as any sort of two-state solution. And so again, we're digging our heels in. We have different sides digging our heels in, and when you say this is our land, and you have someone else say no, this is our land, you're in direct conflict. So you can't just do this multicultural. Everybody's culture is correct, everybody's beliefs are correct, everybody's values are correct. We're going to accept all of them, because at the end of the day, it's like, well, we have this conflict with deep-rooted religious beliefs about whose land is this, whose holy land is this, right? This isn't about two New York real estate tycoons saying like, I want to build a skyscraper here. These are, Jerusalem, Israel, Palestine. Like these are important religious sites that two different groups believe is theirs as far as deep religious beliefs are concerned. All right. And when you're in conflict with one another, you can't say, okay, both of you are correct. Right? It doesn't work like that. Finally, we have this fun cartoon of President Obama over here, and this is every president, right? Every president comes in and says, I'm going to create peace in the Middle East. I'm going to solve this conflict. They've been doing it since 1948. You have Obama looking at these two puzzle pieces that are exact same. Obviously, they're not going to fit together, and he's like, how hard could it be? I'll figure it out. Well, again, we're not talking about two real estate people just kind of trying to compromise on how much money it is to buy this piece of real estate. It's about two different groups who have deeply held cultural beliefs about whose land is this in a very religious, cultural sense. All right. So yeah, you have this question of like, when will there be peace in the Middle East, and how do you get there? There has been some progress made. There's always progress made through different presidencies in the United States. There's some recent progress made under the Trump administration with regard to Israel signing some peace deals with places like Saudi Arabia, for instance. And these are like different Arab states that can sort of help negotiate with the Palestinian people. All right, so that was the reason for if President Trump's trying to get a few other Arab states to say, look, like, you're friends with Palestine, Israel, we're going to get Israel to make peace with you, and then hopefully you can kind of talk to your Palestinian friends to sort of maybe work this out. So it's kind of like working out the issue, trying to sort of bring in a coalition of people, some other friendly people in the area to try to work out the deal. All right. So that's the quick version of what's going on between Palestinians and Israelis. That's why Israel is such a contentious place, and why there are lots of people who say no, like this should be Palestine, or we should have Israel and we should have Palestine. We should have a two-state solution. But again, there's a lot of people who don't believe in the two-state solution because they believe that this is holy land given to their people. And that that there's no compromising when it comes to like deeply held religious beliefs about culture, about place, about community, and about what God has given to you and yours. All right. So this is just a quick example of why some of the issues around multiculturalism are a little bit more complicated than like everybody can be correct all the time. We should value everything. When we start getting into some like deep contentious, deeply held beliefs, it doesn't really work out like that. At some point, people have to start compromising on their beliefs, and that can be a very difficult thing for people to do, especially when you're talking about religious beliefs that are thousands of years old. All right. Okay. That's our quick discussion on Israel and Palestine. Make sure you watch that Vox video that I'll put in the comments below. I also have my video on multiculturalism down below as well if you haven't watched it yet. That gives you a little bit more background on some of the paradox of multiculturalism. All right. See you later.